Hey folks, welcome to the show. My name is Styan Rathnaka, and most people call me T. By day, I'm a site reliability engineer, and by night, I'm a whole bunch of other things. I'm a DJ, I'm a content creator, an aspiring writer, and now I guess a podcast host. On this show called Tech Related, we interview interesting people in tech and adjacent fields to learn about their experiences and answer the question of, what do you really do? Through these interviews, we hope to learn more about their stories, their lessons learned, and the overlap that exists within so many fields in this hyper-connected world. If this is your first time tuning in, please check out our website online at techrelatedpodcast.com, where we'll have a link to all of our speakers, show notes, and any other supporting details. If you enjoyed the show, or even if you hated it, we'd love to hear your feedback. Please reach out to us at show@techrelatedpodcast.com. Yep, that's an email. Or tweet us at TechRelatedShow on Twitter. And now for today's very first guest. All right, today we're joined by our next guest, the man who understands everything about observability, and I keep asking questions for because I don't get it, Callum Styan.
Yes.
There we go. Callum, how are you doing today?
Not bad, how are you?
Not too bad. Thank you for braving this very nice, beautiful Vancouver weather to come inside and record on a very warm day. Vancouver's going through what I'm calling a heat wave, but it's actually just a regular summer day.
I mean, for me, anything more than 20 is hot. So.
Yeah, this is warm. But we're here today to talk about some hot topics, such as what does Ollie mean and why do all the cool kids keep saying it? But more so, I'm curious to hear about your story.
Okay, cool.
So thank you for coming by.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Before we start, one thing I like to ask all my guests is, what are you drinking today? So Callum, what are you drinking today?
I'm drinking, it was some kind of, I think it was a peach ale that you had.
Yeah.
It's pretty good.
I am also drinking the Peach Sunsetter Ale. Shout out Stanley Park Brewing. Please sponsor me.
That would probably be a pretty good sponsor.
Yeah. I don't know if they do tech podcast sponsorships as a...
Why not? Tech bros buy a lot of beer.
That's true. All right. Okay. So Callum, what is your role at work and what is your LinkedIn title if those are different?
I mean, I guess they're different because the title at every company means something different, right? But technically my title is senior software engineer.
Okay.
Internally, we have like levels within each title. Yeah, what was the other part of the question?
What would be like your title if someone looked you up on LinkedIn?
Yeah, senior software engineer.
Okay.
Yeah, at Grafana Labs.
Right.
Yeah.
And what do you do
What
as
do
a
I
senior
do?
software engineer?
I guess we'll go into details later, but
Yeah.
the shortest way to describe it is I build databases for telemetry data.
Okay.
So metrics, logs, traces, profiles, that kind of stuff.
And does this tie into that hot new word 011Y Ollie or what they're talking about?
I guess so. Yeah.
The joke here is that Callum and I are both in the same industry and we're actually working for competing companies.
I guess.
Yeah.
I guess technically we are. Yeah.
Yeah. Or I mean, we're working for same companies in the same space, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, I have a feeling like my own perspective on the like competitor thing, but yeah, we work on software in the same space.
Right.
Yeah.
I should probably say that instead.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's going to interpret it a
Yeah.
different way, regardless of how we describe it, right? So
Yeah.
they can think what they want, but
That's true. So you work on software, building stuff, especially to work with telemetry. And we'll get to more like what that word means. But if you were to describe what you do to like your aunt and uncle at a party, how would you describe that?
All right, I think I've got this one down.
Okay.
Because I get this question all the time. So I have one half of my family that's in like healthcare.
Okay.
And another half that's kind of in like manufacturing and stuff like that, right? So I have two analogies that I usually use. One is like, if you're in healthcare, you're probably used to all these different, I don't know what they call them, sensors, heart rate monitor, all that kind of stuff you can attach to someone and then start getting data from it, right?
Right.
Or if you're in manufacturing, like in a plant that's building thingamabobs.
Yeah.
You've got a bunch of different machines, each that build one specific thing or do something very specific. And they've probably got sensors for the temperature and like, is the oil getting low to keep it cool and how many things has it produced? So
Right.
in software, we have tools that let us collect that kind of information about our software, how it's behaving and how it's performing all the time. So if you're in healthcare, imagine if people's bodies just like their heart always had a thing attached to it where you could see how fast is it beating, how much blood is it pumping, when was the last time like it failed for some reason.
Okay, yeah.
And you could also view the heart rate over time,
Right.
and like the blood pumping throughput over time, that kind of a thing. Yeah, I basically build software that does that
Okay.
for other people's software. So they take their piece of software and they say, I want to know about like how many times an error has happened in the last hour.
Right.
And they add a little bit of code into their software. The software that I write collects that information, stores it, allows them to query it, and display it on nice, pretty graphs.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's so. Again, since we work in a similar space, for what I work with at Lightstep, I work on the telemetry pipeline part of it, which is everything from getting that data in to their backend systems, and other teams take care of storing it and then visualizing it. Where in that part are you? Because you're not dealing with pipeline. Are you dealing with the storing part, or are you dealing with like more of the what happens to the data?
So up until and sort of a little bit also including right now, the whole thing. So I originally joined the company to work on Prometheus, which is an open source metrics database. And for 2 years, I basically only worked on the ingestion portion of that.
Okay.
So I maintain a part of Prometheus that we call remote write, which is basically, normally Prometheus would be living somewhere and it would be scraping metrics from all of your pieces of software.
Right.
And then you would query it and ask, how many errors have I had in the last hour? But as you know, when we start to get these larger deployments of things, especially across regions, having a single Prometheus somewhere that you have to query doesn't really work, or a bunch of them where you have to go and query each different one, that doesn't really work either, right? So remote write is basically a way to take all the data from your Prometheus instance, like as it's scraping it, as it's collecting it, and also send it somewhere else. So you can think of it as something like Telegraph agent or StatsD or the OTel collector. It's similar in that sense, right? It's basically a protocol to send the data somewhere else.
Okay.
But for the last almost 3 years, I've been working on something called Loki, which is like essentially Prometheus, but for logs.
Oh, okay.
And we're only just now as a team kind of transitioning the collection portion of our system to another team.
Gotcha.
We basically have a team that's responsible just for collection, just for building an agent for any type of telemetry data.
Yeah.
That's just in the process of happening. Like we still own parts; they're taking over some parts for the logging stuff. But for the most part, the last 3 years, I've been dealing with the storage side itself.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool. So as a senior software engineer, what does your like regular tasks look like? Are you heads down writing code every day, or are you like, do you do documentation work? Do you design research stuff? What does that work look like for you?
It's interesting. In school, we always thought like, oh yeah, we're going to be sitting there coding all day long, right?
Right.
When my like main project for this period of time is building something, I'd say maybe 50% of my time is actually writing the code or writing tests and doing some basic confirmation of whether the thing I'm building is working properly. The rest of the time is everything else: meetings, code reviews, design docs.
Right.
At Grafana, 95% of what we do is open source. So I'm maintaining Prometheus stuff. I'm responding to questions about Grafana. Loki. There's small portions of Loki that I'm kind of like the main maintainer and reviewing open source contributions for. When my main piece of work is not directly building something, it's usually related to something to do with operations, right?
Okay.
So same as you, we build these things, we deploy them as a software as a service for people to use in the cloud.
Right.
And we need to maintain whatever our objective is with that, right? So we're doing a lot of stuff in terms of like being able to scale the system without having to actually touch it as much ourselves.
Right.
So it's not so much like writing code, it's almost like digging deeper into how some of the things that we use that we didn't actually build ourselves work, and how can we get that 1 or 2% more out of them, to like reduce our cost or reduce latency for our customers or reduce the amount of manual intervention that we as operators have to do when, let's say a new customer signs up and they start sending more data than kind of like a regular free smaller user would.
Yeah.
How do we make it so that we don't actually have to go in and turn some knobs so that the system scales up? It'll just do that for us, right? So there's kind of those two different pieces. And I think for a lot of people outside of tech, they don't necessarily know about that second one.
Oh, that you're doing the operational side of it?
Yeah, and like how much of that, like the amount of time that kind of work takes.
Right.
And like that it's almost more of what you end up doing the higher seniority you are and the bigger your company is.
Right.
Usually the like, and this is maybe just my experience, but usually the like more well-defined coding things are the things that are given to newer people, right?
Yeah.
There's less ambiguity. It has some reasonably defined kind of timeline.
Like the fleshed out cards that you can pick up and be like,
Exactly.
okay, I know what I need to do. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Actually, you mentioned that like there's the two sides, which is the writing the code and the features, and then the operational side. But that first one you touched on is actually pretty big, the open source side. I think that's one thing that, especially explaining what we do in tech to people that are not in tech, would be interested to learn, because most people think that you work for an employer, you build stuff that other people buy, and that's how like that's how the money's made. Like that's how you do work. But I think our industry specifically is interesting because we have a huge intersection with open source. Like that's actually, like you said, you're a maintainer for parts of it. Yeah. My team does a lot of work with open source. I mean, that's also something that's not really touched on well in school either, because when we were in college, we didn't really learn open source, even though we use a lot of open source, which is a weird thing. So I guess as our first champion of open source, can you explain it a bit more? And I realize that there's also like implications of open source that, you know, are a bit dicey, and there's a lot like controversy and stuff like that too. But if you were to explain to like other engineers, maybe especially those that are more early in career that don't get to work with the open source side a lot, what is it all about? Like what's the vibe of open source? Tell me more.
So it varies a lot depending on the project and the space that project is in, and kind of like the structure of the people that are maintaining that project. I mean, the shortest description is that software is either in one of two spaces. It's closed source or it's open source. Okay. Meaning like the people that developed it, when it's closed source, they're the only ones that have the code. They're the only ones that can see it. Nobody else who's using it can go in without doing a whole bunch of extra work to like decompile things or reverse engineer, right?
So like Microsoft and Windows.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Right. I can't go in and say, hey, Microsoft, I found this bug in your piece of code. Here's a potential fix for it. Right. Whereas that's exactly what can happen in open source. The code is all viewable from wherever it's hosted for someone to view, download themselves, build, test, make changes to. They can do what we call forking, which is basically taking that code and changing it, and not necessarily saying that, hey, I'm contributing this back to you. Like, it's open source again. You can have it if you want to, but maybe this is my own thing where I'm building a feature that the maintainers of that original project have said they don't want to maintain, and so I'm forking their project and maintaining something a different way.
Right.
Yeah, like you said, there's some controversy in open source right now about the different licensing types and whether those are really open source or not. But the shortest description is the code is available versus the code is not available.
Right. Yeah. For the work that I do with Lightstep, the open source portion of what we do is the OTLP, Open Telemetry Protocol. Yep. So I guess it makes sense to me that we use open source and like we help build on open source to like bring the protocol forward. And like the money making aspect is that people send their OTLP, which is open source data, conventions, all that, to us, and we display it, do things with that data for a customer, and that's where the money comes in. So like we use open source, and I'm trying to think of like an analogy for how that would work for like a non-tech industry, but it's I guess like if you were at if you were at Home Depot and you were a hardware store, it's like if you were also in a planning committee for better, like 3D printing concrete, maybe. Like,
I mean, so there's a couple ways you could describe it, right? Like, imagine if instead of all of the car manufacturing companies designing and building new, because they're all having to do electric vehicle shit now, right? And they don't necessarily all have expertise in that. Imagine if instead of all competing with each other, who can build the best electric engine, or Tesla and the rest of the companies who can build the best electric battery and all that.
Yeah.
If instead they were working together on a standard for those things, here's like the best design for an electric vehicle motor. And if you want to make it more efficient, you can do that within your company. Or if you want to make the car go faster, you can do that within your company. But at least there's a base where everyone's on the same line at the start of the race, kind of a thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Where the advantages are, like in open source, is that everyone can see the source and like can find security issues or things to improve.
For sure. And like, I don't know, maybe I have a hard time understanding why people would want to do it the other way at this point, but like
source development.
At this point I've spent like 5 years working directly with people from other companies to solve the problems that all of us have, right? And it goes so much faster than if you had fewer people at a single company doing it, right? It's the same idea to me as like, why would you want your entire workforce in one place working on one time zone instead of being spread out, where like I've for the last 5 years been on remote teams. I might finish something and post it for review at 5 or 6 p.m. my time. And in 6 hours, when the guys or girls from the EU start logging on, right, they can start immediately reviewing it. And then by the time I come around the next day, we have a quick meeting about it. They show me what they built. I do a review of that and then go back into building what I was building, right? Whereas it would be much more linear, less
you got to wait for the next day to start.
Exactly.
Yeah. One thing I thought about, especially with open source, and like, I feel like open source seems like a thing that, especially if you're going through college, you're like, I don't really get it. But parts of open source culture are actually kind of baked into what we do every day. And the reason I thought about this the other day is I was trying to explain pull request to someone. And pull request is the act of when you're trying to make a change to a code base, you get it reviewed by someone's peer review, and once they thumbs up and they approve, you merge into the code base. The point being that everything's reviewed and everything should technically be working at all points. But like, that's an integral part of open source. Like, the whole PR flow comes, I don't know the history, so I can't say if it comes from open source, but like, if you've done a PR, you've done some sort of open source development, at least within your own company, even if the source is closed. But the principle is that everyone gets to see the changes that are being made, and you can track it through time.
I mean, so I don't know how many of your listeners would know the tools we're using versus not, but so for example, on something like GitHub, right? Whether you're using GitHub for open source or GitHub Enterprise or whatever within your company, right? Probably within your code base, you might have like automated or not people listed as maintainers of specific things, right? T is the maintainer for the metrics collection pipeline. Somebody else is the maintainer for the logs collection pipeline. And then automatically when somebody else comes along and says, oh, hey, I've fixed this bug for the metrics collection pipeline. They don't even have to know that you're the maintainer for it. It will just tag you automatically because you're the maintainer, right? That happens regardless of whether it's open or closed source, right? Within an internal team, you might have
the subject matter experts.
Like on what's the Atlassian thing? Like you might have listed like
owners or not owners.
Right. So really, the only difference from my perspective is the people that you're working with don't necessarily work at the same company as you. They're not paid by the same person, but you're in essence still on a team together. You're paid to be working on the same thing.
Did you do open source work before you started at the company you're at now, or before it?
A little bit.
Okay.
So when we were in school together, I don't remember which year it was exactly, but there's this thing called Google Summer of Code,
Okay.
where basically Google sets up some amount, I don't know exactly how many anymore because it goes up and down, but some amount of essentially scholarships for high school, well, I think it's anyone now, but high school and university students to contribute to open source projects.
Okay.
So open source projects come along and they have, a one-page proposal of, hey, we think a student could finish this in, I don't remember if it's 6 or 8 weeks or something like that.
Right.
And then Google reviews them. The projects get accepted or not. There's a process and timeline for students to apply. Hey, I know how to work on this. I would do X, Y, and Z, blah, blah, blah. And then Google basically hands you $5,000 or $8,000 US and says, you are now working on this for the next 2 months.
Wait, you did that?
I tried to.
Oh, okay.
I did not get accepted.
Okay.
Maybe you know it. There's this open source DJ software called Mix.
Yeah.
With like three X's.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, somebody at Grafana now was a maintainer of that around the same time. But
wow.
this was like maybe it was second year or beginning of third year.
So like 2014 probably?
Yeah, 2014, 2015, 2016, something like that. Oh, actually, no, 2016. We graduated in 2016.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Time flies.
And then, so that didn't work out, but I had some experience of like, we were using open source software. I didn't necessarily contribute, but I would submit issues, which are not necessarily like bugs, but it's like, hey, I would like to use your software in this way that's slightly different than how you, and so I'd submit things like that, right?
Oh man, here's sorry, tangent, hot take. If people did more open source work, I feel like they'd be better communicators. Yes. Because there's so many issue templates that if you just learned how to read issue templates and got used to it, you'd be such a better communicator. Anyways.
Yeah. We can get into like the all the other logistics that come along with an open source project, right?
Yeah.
But that's definitely part of it. It's like how do you get the information that you actually need from the person who's trying to report a problem with your software in like a way that isn't a pain in the ass for them,
right?
But also still gives you the information you think you're going to need, so you don't have to have this back and forth with somebody who's in China or Germany all the time, when really all they want is, I have this problem, can you fix it?
Right.
Yeah. So then a couple years later, we finished school, right? I'm still working at not my current employer, but the previous one.
Yeah.
And we had a monitoring system that was essentially falling over every day. It was, even then in 2017 or early 2018, it was like multiple years old Grafana instance, multiple years old Graphite database.
Yeah.
Both of which were running on a single VM on like a dedicated node in one of our own data centers. We weren't even like public cloud users at this point.
Okay.
It was falling over all the time. Like ops would have to go in and system CTL restart Graphite kind of a thing.
Kick the server, yeah.
Exactly, on off.
Yeah.
And the team I was on was responsible for essentially like a networking tool. It was basically like a tunnel for our customers into our network. And we were having outages and couldn't. If you have an outage, right? If the system's down, and you can't go and look at data about why it's down, what's happening.
That's bad.
Then what are you supposed to do, right?
Right.
So not only was that happening and we couldn't get the information, but we had been telling managers that like, hey, something's going to go wrong. We need time to fix it, but we also need more resources put into this monitoring system so that we can figure out how to fix it in the first place.
Right.
We were basically not given time for either of those things. And then also told that the problem is our fault.
Oh, no.
So that was fun. I basically put together a big proposal of how we can replace the system we were using. Yeah. With a couple of different things, one of which was Prometheus.
Okay.
And internally at the time, like I said, our own data centers. Yeah. Kind of containers, but like very low level LXC containers, not Docker or anything easy to use. Yeah. No orchestrator. There was one team that was kind of playing with Kubernetes. And I was like, hey, we could use this thing called Prometheus. It's really easy. And I put together a design doc of how we can, and anyways, that didn't end up happening. But as part of like trying to be able to convince the company that we should do this, I was like, somebody should have some amount of knowledge or expertise about how this thing that I'm saying we want to use works. And so as part of that, I started just doing random tiny little one-off contributions to Prometheus.
Okay.
Which actually, interestingly enough, was enough that when I interviewed to join the company that I'm at right now, somebody else who was a Prometheus open source team member crashed my interview.
Okay.
They weren't actually invited. Tom, if you end up watching this, they weren't actually invited to the interview. I was interviewing technically for a different team. Yeah. And they just saw it on somebody else's calendar. It's like,
I know that name.
I know that name.
Yeah.
And that was strictly because I had decided, kind of on company time, to start contributing to open source. Right. So,
okay. I kind of feel like this could be a tagline. It's like, consider open source as your way to get into a company, but
Yeah, I mean, it's not a bad option, right?
Yeah.
Like, I see lots of posts on like CS career questions or places like that, right? Of like, what should I build or what should I do to like make my new grad resume more, what would the word even be?
Relevant?
Look better, right?
Yeah,
like
better,
how to get yours picked out of the pile, right?
Yeah.
Or not thrown into the trash immediately. And everybody's always like, oh, build this example website or this iOS app or something like that. I mean, those are good ideas. Those are better than doing nothing, for sure.
Right.
Like the stuff you do in school is not necessarily realistic and going to get you a job, and those kinds of projects are.
Yeah.
But the experience of working in open source is more realistic than doing something by yourself.
Right.
So for sure, I would recommend it. If you've got some random little tool that you like to use, just go check what's in their issues.
Yeah.
Every year, what is it, in March or April maybe?
Yeah.
DigitalOcean does this thing with GitHub that they call, oh, sorry, no, that doesn't make any sense because it's called Hacktoberfest. So it's in October.
Yeah.
Where basically open source projects on GitHub can just tag things as like, this is appropriate for somebody new to work on. So yeah, look for things like that. Like going back to open source project logistics, within Prometheus, we tried to label things as like a priority or not, P1 through P3. P1 is like, we're definitely going to do it and it'll probably get done by somebody on the team.
Right.
P3 is like, maybe if somebody has time.
Yeah.
And then we also tried to label things as like good for new users or like potentially there's dragons here kind of a thing, right?
Okay.
So go look at open source projects and look at the labels they have.
Yeah.
And most of them have like, it's old school, but IRC or mailing lists or will be in some Slack in some channel.
Yeah.
Open source projects, for the most part, are always looking for new maintainers because they always have more than the people that are already contributing can do.
Right.
So
I was thinking about open source. I was thinking about how would I teach someone to work as a new engineer? Because like there's all these coding boot camps and like there are like 36,000 to-do apps, like to-do list apps. Like, how can you create a to-do list app? I'm like, that's great. But like the thing about those projects is that you are doing greenfield work. You are starting from scratch. You kind of know what the problem is. And you can just like build your own. It's like a Minecraft. You can just like build your own solution.
Yeah.
But the first thing that you will do once you get to a new company is you will be asked to build a feature. And like if your tech lead and your manager is nice to you, they'll give you something that's like relatively greenfield. But like more often than not, especially when you're like further along, you're building in someone else's code base. And like I feel like open source contributions are great because it's kind of like starting on hard mode. You'll have issues that are like, hey, build this thing or like fix this bug. Okay, it's like, okay, cool. That's like my Jira card.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, what is the context? Like, oh, I should read all these issues or like, but like the hard mode is like, you don't really have someone on your team to help you. To like assigned person to ask for help. There's people on the issues and people on the board, but like you kind of have to figure that out and you have to like go and like explicitly ask for help, which if you can do like before you've even started at a job, like that's such a huge advantage in my opinion.
Yeah. There's two parts to that, right? There's like not being afraid to ask help,
Mm-hmm.
but also doing some amount of your own due diligence before
Right.
you ask for help, right? I know I have been guilty of this in the past, but sometimes you get very frustrated not being able to make any progress, and
Mm-hmm.
you're like, okay, well, I can just virtually tap that person on the shoulder.
Right.
I know they know about this thing. That person also has their own shit they're doing, right? If you can't demonstrate to them that you've at least put some effort into this yourself,
Yeah.
that's even more so for open source, because a lot of the times maintainers of projects are not necessarily paid to work on those things.
Right. It's like a passion project. Yeah.
Yeah. It's becoming better with like features on GitHub where you can like sponsor projects, and more companies like, hey, we rely really heavily on this thing. Let's employ one person to work on it all the time, kind of a thing. But
It's my dryer.
also in the opposite direction, like if you show the maintainers of a project that you are passionate about for one reason or another, working on that and helping them,
Yeah.
they're more than happy to, even from another time zone, set up an hour-long call with you just to help you step through the code, right?
Right. It's like you show effort, like signs of effort. And like trying to solve the problem.
Right? Like, here's what I've looked at so far. This is the structure that I don't understand. How come this function is implemented this way? Like, someone will be like, oh, I understand how that works.
Right.
Let's talk about that tomorrow at this time for half an hour. And yeah. So I had people like that when I was first starting contributing to Prometheus. Yeah, I don't know if that hadn't happened, I don't know if I would have stayed involved as I was, but yeah, I don't know where we started.
No, it was a tangent about open source, but that's great. Cool. Okay, so if we get back to the script, I mean, it ties in pretty well, which is, let me make a marker here. So we got into the topic of open source because you talked about what you do in your day job, and there's like 3 parts to it: open source work, building new features, and then the operational side. We started talking about open source, which is really cool. The next question is, this is like the meat, and one of my favorite questions to ask is that, so Callum, as a senior software engineer, what would you say you do here? And I guess more specifically, I like asking, like, what does a day in the life look like? And a cool thing we've got to do in some of our previous episodes is I actually asked if they would mind looking at their calendar and taking me through a day. Obviously, that's hard because sometimes you can't share things that are on your calendar. But like, can you think of like a day you've had recently, and can you like walk me through what a day looks like?
Yeah. So my calendar is actually not that interesting.
Okay.
Because we're distributed, and I work with, whether it's an open source or within the company, people on completely different sides of the world. I essentially have like, depends with like daylight savings time and stuff, but like 7 or 8 a.m. to like maybe noon at the latest, where maybe I have some meetings.
Okay.
And when I say maybe, one day I might have 2 hours, and the other 4 days of the week I might have nothing.
Oh, wow. That's really nice.
Or like, maybe half an hour or something like that. And then basically same for my afternoons. My afternoons are basically always open to just work on whatever I'm working on. So my calendar's not that interesting.
Okay.
My days are usually, the morning I do whatever couple meetings I have. So we, like, once a week we'll meet as a team. But even now that is split into people in North America, South America versus everyone else.
How big is your team, out of curiosity?
Technically, as far as the company's concerned, it's multiple teams, but it's, if you include like the managers and product people, it's roughly 20. 15 to 18 engineers, and
Wow.
Yeah,
That's big.
but again, that's split between North America, South America, and then Europe and also Asia, right? So not to go on another tangent, but the thing that I really appreciate at Grafana is that our on-call is basically always what we call follows the sun, which for doctors we when we're building a software as a service, we have a pager system, and if shit hits the fan, whoever's on call gets paged, even if it's Saturday at 4 in the morning, 3 in the morning, right? At lots of companies, you're basically on call for a week, 24/7.
Right.
That's starting to not become as common, but definitely in the past, that was the norm. At Grafana, I'm on call for 12 hours.
Okay.
So like 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. The 5 days of the week.
That's nice.
And then once every 3 months, I have a weekend.
Okay.
So we split the weekends between everyone, those 15 or 18 engineers. And then the 12 hours for the rest are split between North America, South America, and Europe and Asia.
That's awesome. Like you're not carrying a laptop after dinner on weekdays. Like that's wow.
Yeah. I still like slightly arrange my life that week around like, okay, maybe I'll go for a walk at 8 instead of at 7.
Right.
So going back, my day and meetings, right? So maybe I have a couple meetings in the morning, like a weekly meeting that's kind of split now, or some one-on-ones with like, this was one of the things that I thought was interesting, the Jeff being a manager, and also I think, I don't remember the name of your last guest.
Sadie?
Yeah. Being a team lead, they were kind of talking about one-on-ones like only as a person who reports to someone else, right? Like,
right.
I have one-on-ones with like people that are directly on the same level as me.
Okay.
I have one-on-ones with people that are on completely different teams. I have one-on-ones with people from outside the company.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I think one-on-ones have already been discussed, but like I might have a couple of those.
Yeah.
And then I have essentially usually like 5 to 6 hours worth of time that I just choose how to use.
Okay.
So I try to allocate like 1 to 2 hours per day for reviews. 1 hour or so for like specifically new things that I want to do that aren't necessarily scheduled as projects yet. And then the rest to directly like whatever I am working on or the group that I'm a part of right now is working on.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. That's actually really, your schedule sounds the nicest from what I've heard so far, because your on call is only 12 hours and like you get to have less meetings, or it seems like you have your meetings. It's a result of having specific collaboration time, right? With multiple time zones. You got to be much more intentional about when you have your meetings.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it can take some getting used to, right? Like the first 2 years I was at the company where I said I was working on Prometheus itself. The guy that I was working with the closest at the time worked for a completely different company.
Yeah.
He was in Colorado, or still is in Colorado, which is I think only 1 hour difference.
Okay, it's a mountain time.
Yeah, I think they're mountain time.
Yeah.
But internally within the company, the 2 people or 3 people, I guess, that I could get reviews from on the things I was working on, 2 were in India and 1 was in Germany.
Okay, yeah.
So with the guy in India, there's like almost no overlap, right? Like I would finish my work at 5 or 6, go and do things, have dinner, go for a walk, take my dogs out, stuff like that. And then at like 9 o'clock, I'd send him a message because I'd seen him online.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, can you review my thing? Can we meet for half an hour, like in an hour or something like that?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And then other times, because of people in EU, their day's finishing later, right? Like we do these virtual offsites, right?
Yeah.
Those might start at 6 a.m. for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Offsites being like, is it like a weekly thing or like quarterly?
We try to do one every quarter or every other quarter.
Okay, so it's like an actual like on-site, off-site meeting, but just virtual.
Yeah. We started them during COVID because I think anyone who's been working at this in this industry realizes that like that scheduled more than just like a meeting about this specific thing, kind of a discussion is useful.
Yeah, you need to know the people you work with. Yeah, for
sure.
Sure.
Yeah. And a lot of the times we don't necessarily have time to think about the really futuristic things.
Right.
The things that are more than a year or 2 years out that maybe when we talk about them, we'll realize, oh, we should actually be doing that 6 months from now, not like in the distant future. We're not even thinking about it right now, right? So we do one a quarter, and we try to do every other quarter in person.
Okay.
That changes depending on like what's going on in the world the last 3 years, obviously, right? But yeah.
And you're fully remote, so this is like a very fully remote. Gig.
I mean, in theory, we've had some offices always.
Yeah.
But it was never more than like 10 or 15 people in a single office. I think the last remaining office, maybe I'm wrong about this. I don't know if anyone will watch and tell me I am, but I think the last remaining office, which was in Stockholm, I think that the rental got canceled. So
Gotcha.
the company gives us like a refund if we wanted to use like a co-working space.
Okay,
right?
that's nice.
Not everybody has the space for a dedicated like work setup at home. Maybe they have kids that are home running around in the summer or something like that, right?
Right.
So I know there are some people that have kind of pooled theirs together and rented like a 6-person room at a WeWork or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, technically the company's entirely remote, no offices, all that fun stuff.
What are your thoughts on that? Because I know when we all started, we were all in person. But I think you switched to your current role before the pandemic and you switched to remote.
Yeah.
What was that like for you? And like, how do you feel about it now?
Yeah. So I've been remote for, it'll be 5 years in August.
Okay. Wow.
The last time I was looking for a job when I joined this company, I was specifically looking for a remote position.
Okay.
Which at the time was pretty difficult. I wanted a specific language in a specific area of software, and I wanted it to be remote.
Right.
So I really limited my options. In the beginning, it's hard. It's really hard, right? Going from school, our school was pretty difficult in terms of the time commitment they expect from people, right?
Right.
To work, which still has a time commitment, but when you're in the office, especially, there's like water cooler chats and you have lunch with everyone, and maybe you play Mario Kart for 10 minutes after lunch or something, right?
Yeah.
And when you're, I find when you're in person with other people around, there's like this, I don't know what you would call it.
Like a cohort mentality, I guess.
Yeah, right. And like everyone else is around you is working, so you feel like you should be working too, right? Whereas you have to impose that on yourself.
Yeah.
At home. So for the beginning, it was hard, especially with the time zone thing.
Yeah.
And for the first 2 years I was at the company, I was essentially, if I was to explain it like an in-person thing, I had my own office in the basement, in like the utility closet of the basement.
Right.
And like maybe once a week for half an hour I talked to someone.
Yeah.
I was working on my own projects. The person I was working the most closely with was at a different company in a different area of the continent.
Okay.
And I was working on something that for me at the time was like intellectually difficult.
Right.
Challenging, right? So it was hard.
Yeah.
It was really hard. I knew that I wanted the freedom to like set my own work schedule and all that. I've always had an issue with like, oh, well, it's 9 to 5, so you have to wait until after 5 to go to the dentist or whatever.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
sometimes I feel done at 3 o'clock.
Right.
Other days I can work until 10 or something. Like,
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, that was essentially the thought behind it.
Yeah. I'm finding it very hard even now, like remote, because I'm a very extroverted person and I love being around people. Like COVID sucked because I had to go remote, like no choice about it.
Yeah.
But even now it's like, it's really hard. Like that self-imposing that discipline is something you have to do. Like I will work on this from this time to this time. Like I will focus on this.
Yeah.
But it's also hard to ask for help. And like, which is weird because my team is great and they're always like, just ask questions. But like, even before the pandemic, asking for help quicker was something I was worried about, like imposter syndrome, all that. But like when you have to like virtually shoulder tap and ask a question, type it out, and be like, you see them typing. I don't know. It's like really anxiety inducing. I think what you mentioned about the one-on-ones, like setting multiple one-on-ones, not just with your report or your supervisor, is important. I feel like I've somehow ended up doing that through a different path anyways. And I agree. I very much enjoy that. The best parts of what I found working remote is when we end up in just like random Zoom or Meet calls and start working through stuff throughout the day. I guess it's the closest thing to working in person.
I mean, I still will have like ad hoc pairing sessions or review sessions or whatever. There's a channel in our company Slack that's basically just like a shit posting channel for like memes and random discussions. We fight about like what's the best way to construct a sandwich or something like that.
Right. Sandwich wars.
That channel will have like a Friday afternoon call where they just talk about random things for fun, right? Like that, all that stuff is super important regardless of whether you work in person or not. And I would say it's almost more important for remote because you don't have that spontaneous type of interaction with people, right? Where you see them at lunch or you see them in the hallway.
Right.
I don't know. One of the things that worked for me in terms of the like, it being harder to learn things or ask questions or whatever, remotely, in the beginning was setting a specific time where I would do that every day. And for me, it was also partially because of the time zone thing, right?
Right.
I need to ask a question before 9 a.m. Otherwise, I'm not getting an answer until tomorrow.
Yeah.
But also, like if you have a specific time you're doing that every day, you just lose that anxiety because you're doing it so often, right? Also, one of the ways to learn a whole lot really fast and it not necessarily be directly tied to the thing that you're working on, where you kind of have a bit more of like, oh, this isn't going great, I'm not progressing as fast, blah, blah, blah. Code reviews for something that you know nothing about and isn't your area of expertise. Lots of people try and avoid it, but going on call. And then even if you're not on call, joining the channels or calls or whatever your company has for incidents.
Right.
And, be respectful of like, don't try to get involved if there's already enough people, right? If there's already enough cooks in the kitchen, but just being a fly on the wall or reading the post-incident review or doing a code review for some feature that somebody else is building where, like, let's say it's a new language, you can learn some of the paradigms for that language, or you can learn a bit about how that piece of the code base is architected and the different pieces fit together. That's something that's really difficult, especially earlier in your career, coming from like these smaller, really nicely, tightly coupled things that we build in school to like these big abstracted code bases, right? Like,
I think like sitting in on an incident, especially like one thing is like be a fly on the wall, but like don't like ask questions. But if like, someone's trying to like get the server up and running, probably not the best time to ask like, what is a server? Like, not that people would.
Right. Yeah. I think everybody understands the like, not to call them out, but the manager or the customer support person or what's the role your friend has, account exec or something, right? Like there's an incident for a particular customer. When's it going to be fixed? The customer, right? Like, don't be the engineer equivalent of that, right? Like asking questions just to ask questions or learn something. Like if you see something that you think is relevant, write it down for later or ask it now, depending on the situation. But try to get involved in some way. Like one of the things that I would suggest if you're nervous about doing that at first, I don't know if they still do it, but GitLab used to record their incident Zoom calls
for like public to see. That's
wow,
that's wild.
I don't know if they're posted on their website or on YouTube or both, but like you could watch their because GitLab is like an open source alternative to GitHub or Bitbucket or whatever.
Their incident postmortems are fantastic.
Everything about GitHub's like documentation and GitLab's documentation, like they even go down as far as like documenting how the company works and all of that publicly on their website, within a repo that anybody else could like fork or send a pull request to or whatever. They at least in the past, but I think still post their, unless there's something like internal security related, right? Post their incident review calls, and you can sit through
wild.
How do they go about debugging it? What are the things they're thinking about?
Yeah.
Like how could you apply that to the thing you're working on? That kind of thing. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Coming back to that first point, which is like, if you don't know how a system works, a good way to do it is to help out in code reviews. My biggest fear is like, it's like the same thing as being an incident, right? Like I don't want to be going into a code review and asking all these questions, but at the same time, if you're the one that's being code reviewed, you should be making it approachable. Like I feel like most people will be willing to explain what's going on in their code.
Right. Yeah. So there's a couple things like, for the person who's being reviewed, a lot of the times you have been writing something and submitting the pull request kind of in a rushed manner.
Yeah.
Like this thing is broken, we got paged for it, or I want to get this thing into this weekly release, or right. And so it's very easy to miss like trivial things.
Right.
Or to write the code in a way that is obvious to you. Or anyone else who's been in that code base for a long time.
Yeah.
But not in a way that's readable, understandable to somebody new, right? Yeah. So maybe you didn't leave enough comments, or you structured the code in a kind of like internal way that this specific company uses.
Right.
So somebody coming along and not asking like, why did you do it this way? But like, can you explain to me why you did it this way? I prefer getting those kinds of reviews to the like, can you rename this variable? Because the Go documentation says that like, yes, I still need to do that, right? But knowing that the person who reviewed my code, one maybe pointed out a couple of small things that like I need to change or I could have been clear about, and also they're learning something from it. Yeah. I would much rather have that situation than like the guy who's always trying to impose his way of doing things. Right? Yeah. Yeah. I
found the big, like this, I have this weird analogy that I always feel like, I think this is where the anxiety hits, where it's like, I feel like coding is like rock climbing, and I've never done it, but I feel like it's the type of rock climbing where you have to go up and put the clamps in. Yeah. So if you fall down, you're only going as low as wherever the clamp was. Yeah. And I feel like when you're doing PRs, it's like partner climbing. You lead the way, you put the clamp, and you tell someone to come up. And like a good PR or a good reviewer is someone that can like climb up with you, or if someone needs help, it's like you're helping that person up to get to your level. Yep. But like the nit on like, can you rename this variable, is like someone looking at your clamp be like, oh, you should just like rotate this like 25 degrees and that's better. It's like, well, you're not really.
And like that kind of stuff is still necessary, right? Like things should be consistent, right, and named in ways that are obvious as to like what it's used for and what it's doing. So that kind of stuff is important, not to like
diminish
shit on people who are like, because a lot of people don't want to review for those kinds of things either, right? It's a pain in the ass to go through and like, did they name this variable consistently with all the other instances of that? Like, that's not easy to do, right? Yeah. My point was more that like, if you start asking higher level questions about why something is being done the way it's being done, and make it obvious that you're asking that question because you'd like to understand, not because you think, oh, there's a better way to do it. Yeah. People are more than happy to walk you through that. There's a couple other analogies, like for anyone who's really into outdoor stuff, like for hiking and camping and all this kind of thing, they have this like, leave the campsite cleaner than you found it, right?
Clean campground, yeah.
So one of the things that that I think is really good to do as well is like, okay, you've gotten a bit used to this code base, doing like reviews for other people. Maybe next time around, after you review something and you're thinking, okay, they did that thing this way, can I apply that and clean up some other part of the code base? Right. Doing that, right? Like one specific file. Is there anything that in there that I can apply what I've learned, or learn a little bit more by trying to apply that thing to that piece? Right. Another thing that I think, in my opinion, is a little bit related is if you're the person who, especially when you're new, if you're the person who's having your code reviewed, the sooner you can detach your like personal mental health from your code.
Are you talking directly to me? Because I feel this. Yeah.
This was me too, right?
Yeah.
Like the first year that I was at Grafana,
Mm-hmm.
working on those things in my own little corner, I got reviews from like the same 3 people over and over and over again for a year straight. And at the beginning, I was like, how come they did a review and left all these comments and then also pushed a change to my branch? Like, that's my code. Why are you fucking with my code?
Right.
Like, I'm great at this. Why? Like, the sooner you can get over that, like, I mean, obviously there's assholes out there.
Yeah.
But for the most part, other than having a way to know who worked on something in the past and ask them for context, nobody gives a shit about who wrote the piece of code, and if it's good or bad, like being able to blame them.
Right.
I know it's a little bit ironic. The command is git blame, but like
get attribute. Yeah.
Right. Like the amount of times I've looked at something and be like, what idiot wrote this, and then get blamed and it was me. Like
Spider-Man meme just pointing at each other.
Right, exactly. Like the sooner you can get to that state of like not attaching your self-worth to like the last thing that you built. And also being okay with like, hey, this person knows more than I do.
Right.
And that's why they're pointing this thing out. And then eventually you become that person for your own code. Yeah. One of the things that my team early on, again, like those first 2-3 years that I was at the company, started making me do, because they were getting fed up with reviewing my code multiple times in a row, was they would not review until I had done my own review. Okay. So I would open the pull request and do my own PR review.
Interesting. Okay.
I would do my own nitpicks about variable names. I would also, what I would do is I would open the PR on Friday. Yeah. And then Monday morning I'd come back to it. Oh, okay. Yeah. And I don't remember why. Like I don't
cleanse the palate. Yeah.
I don't even remember what I ate for breakfast today or why. Right. Like so that's another thing I suggest is
especially with GitHub's new draft mode. Like that's so easy to do now.
Oh yeah. Draft mode is great. For everyone out there who doesn't understand, please don't take draft PRs as like, I think this thing is mergeable. Yeah. I have a coworker and he's probably one of the smartest people I've ever met. Yeah. But fairly routinely over the last 3 years, I've like opened a draft PR or before draft PRs were a thing. I opened a PR specifically like, this is a work in progress. Yeah. I'm not trying to say this thing is mergeable. It's just like an example of maybe what we can do to implement something. And I'm like kind of a pain in the ass. I have like to do comments everywhere and code commented out and stuff like that. But like, and then people come along and review it as if
it's ready.
I think it's mergeable, and then they think I'm an idiot and I think they're an asshole for the types of comments they're making. It's like, yeah, I think there's still a bit of a disconnect with some of the newer tooling that's being developed of like the way people think should do things. Right. So that's one of the things that I think newer people, regardless of whether you're new in general or just new to that team or that company, should be asking is, and it's kind of a pain because some teams don't set a standard and everyone will have a bit of a different way of doing things, but ask people what they expect from you when you want to ask a question of them, when you want a review from them, whether it's a code review or a design doc review or something like that. Right. Like, how do you expect me to present the information in a way that makes it easy for you to do the thing that I want you to do? Yeah. How do I need to structure my PR or my GitHub issue or my code comments? What format do you want the design doc in if we don't have a standard one? Like, yeah.
The other day I was thinking about like, man, what if human interactions were codified, like codable? And like one thing I've always said is like email is just programming for humans. Like which is like, there's things wrong with that analogy. But one thing I've loved, especially working with Go, which I'm finally on because Callum and a lot of people have been telling me to switch from Node to like Go, which I finally have done. But one thing I love about Go, it's a type language, but more specifically, you can specify exactly what needs to be returned with every function.
Right.
And it's like asking for feedback, like ask feedback parentheses, give me back like synchronous, detailed code reviews, like push to branch, like specify exactly what you need, and like life will be better. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things as part of that, like, Callum, we're having to review your shit too often.
Yeah.
Do your own reviews. If the description of your PR does not say what you're trying to do, how you're trying to implement it, whether or not you've thought about other ways to implement it, the ways you've tested it, whether or not you've benchmarked it, blah, blah, blah. Like, obviously every once in a while you have like a one-line change that's really obvious, right? But if you're submitting something that's like more than one function long and you don't have that kind of a description in your PR description, which is like, hey, this is what I'm trying to do and why, and here's what it's solving, blah, blah, blah. If you don't have that kind of description, I think you're kind of being a dick to the people that you're asking for a review from, right? They are giving up some of their time to help you. Yeah,
the onus is on you to make it easy.
You should make it as easy as possible for them to do the thing that you want them to do.
Right. Yeah. Really good advice. This is just me like now being sad about engineering and asking Callum for advice. So I love it. Sweet. Okay. How are we doing for time here? Oh, wow.
I'm still good. So whatever you want.
Sweet. Yeah. Okay. So this is a loaded question, but like, what are some of the biggest things in your industry right now? Or what do you like talking about that's big in your industry right now?
I mean, we can talk about like the flame war kind of things, or we can talk about the thing that I think is actually super cool right now.
Let's probably talk about the second one. What are you most excited about?
Continuous profiling.
Okay, tell me more. Actually, let me explain what I know about profiling, and you tell me how far off I am.
Yeah.
So profiling, what I've seen it before, is that you can go through a program and see exactly how much memory it's taking, how like each function call executes, how long it takes, like how much memory it consumes, where it is in the call stack.
Exactly.
So that essentially, instead of just seeing like log lines or traces, you can see like exactly how much each piece consumes to get better at making it more better.
Exactly. So in the past, people had things like I think it's called S-trace.
Okay.
Which is essentially like call stack tracing and execution timing and stuff like that for a single process or like a single executable on a Linux machine.
Okay.
Imagine if you could do that for like a distributed system.
Okay. Distributed system means like multiple services where it's not just like function calls within the same program. You're calling different servers elsewhere to do things.
Exactly. So it's almost like if you could view a trace, a distributed trace. Not, again, another buzzword.
Yeah.
Imagine if you could view a distributed trace from the context of a single process within that trace. Okay. So, for example, like we have all of our systems have this ingestion pipeline, right?
Right.
And so there's a piece that deals with authentication, and there's a piece that deals with checking and applying rate limits, and there's another piece that deals with verifying that data and then committing it to disk and also to blob storage, blah, blah, blah. We might show you the usage, memory usage, CPU usage, blah, 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 of the whole system.
Yeah.
And then you can drill down to like a specific function call on a specific instance of this service. And then it'll show you like, hey, this thing took this amount of time and the function call took this amount of time, and Go is a garbage collected language. The garbage collection took this amount of time.
That's cool.
So
yeah, okay.
So if you've ever used pprof, basically imagine if you could Prometheus scrape pprof profiles,
right,
and view the change in memory usage of a specific function over time.
Right, because right now what I would have to do if I want to do that is like okay, what are the calls that are being done? Okay, we're hitting this microservice. Okay, now I gotta find out which instance is running, and then go in, profile that, and then put it all together and figure out what's happening.
Yep.
If we could do the exact same thing we're doing with like distributed traces, but for profiling.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
man,
So
that would make my job so much easier.
yeah. Yeah. So now what you can do is you can see like, okay, we had a spike in latency on this endpoint for our web service, right? Which is backed by a whole bunch of other different things internally. And you could, via metrics, see where that spike is happening for which specific endpoint, because you've got a nice label it's saying endpoint equals do thing. And if you know the time and the endpoint, and you probably have some idea of the internal pieces that serve whatever functionality needs to happen for that endpoint to send the actual end result back to the user.
Yeah.
You can go and query we have a database for this, query the profiling service and see like, okay, here are all the profiles that we scraped from the service that's responsible for doing that thing. And when the spike happened, there was a X% change in garbage collection.
Like anomaly detection. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or it's not really anomalies, but yeah.
Right now you're like looking at it manually, but identifying that kind of a thing.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. Because like a lot of the times when people, especially from school and using languages that don't necessarily have as much tooling, or like tooling that's as easy and intuitive to use. So for example, like before we met, but when I was still at BCIT, we were forced to use C.
Yeah.
Right. And tooling for C is not the easiest thing to use. Like maybe you got to recompile the tool yourself and everything's a terminal interface. Like people who have used it for a long time can use it, but it's not nice and shiny.
Especially not for like first time, like in entering the software.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. And it's not necessarily like, I don't want to be GDB debugging something when I'm on call, for example. Right. Where was I going with this?
How it helps with learning a system or. Well, we can come back to it.
Oh yeah. Like people will be coming from a system like that, and they'll start with Go and they'll be like, oh my God, like it has a built-in framework for testing. Yeah. And not only does it have a built-in framework for testing, it has built-in benchmark testing where it will tell you like from this commit to this commit, it was this percent faster and used this percent less memory.
I didn't even know we could do that. Okay.
There you go.
There we go. Go continues to surprise me.
Yeah. If you write instead of func test thing, benchmark thing. Oh, okay. And then wrap it in a for loop that does b dot uppercase n. Yeah. Which is basically the number of iterations that the benchmarker will run it for. And then there's a command line flag where it will tell you the number of objects allocated, the total number of bytes allocated, and then there's even a tool that you can take two different benchmark outputs with like test names and compare them. Wow. And so you can say like, hey, on this commit, this was the benchmark, and on this commit, this was the benchmark, and my new commit is 5% faster. That's very cool. So going back to open source logistics, if somebody's making a change that they, it could be one of two things: a new feature, and that new feature is maybe on a hot path where like performance is improvement, or they're making a change that they say is a performance improvement. We'll ask them like, hey, can you run the benchmark and show us the output? Or can you write a benchmark? And
That's part of the PR process. Yeah,
exactly.
That's very cool.
So people might like come into Go and see those kinds of things like, oh my God, this new tooling is awesome. And it makes my life so much easier. Yeah. For me, continuous profiling is basically that, but for distributed systems.
It's interesting to me because like coming out of school, the only debugging method I really knew about was logging. Like,
I mean, I still use like format.println every day, right?
I mean, like it has its place. It's the easiest way to get some feedback on what's happening or which code path you're on. Yeah. But it's like, even in like the last year, it's like learning more about metrics, learning more about traces. And that's like, this helps see so much more of what's happening in a system. And I learned none of this in school.
So that goes back to the like getting involved in an open source project rather than just building a thing to put on your portfolio when you're applying to companies.
Yeah.
You'll be learning those sorts of things, right?
Because if you're being told to run a benchmark, then you're like, oh, I got to learn what.
Right. Or the feature you're writing has to have tests in order to be accepted. Like testing at school was like completely manual.
Yeah. We did unit testing.
I mean, we did unit testing, but like, I remember so we went to the same school, obviously. And in our last year, we had to do this major project, right? And as part of that major project, you have to submit a report of like, here's what I built and the features it supports and the thing it does and blah, 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 and why it's interesting.
Right.
And also here's all the ways I tested it.
Yeah.
I basically submitted like screenshots of my automated testing output.
Yeah.
Because at this time I was working at an automated testing company.
Yeah.
And the people at the school reviewing my project were like, what do you mean automated testing? Like you need to write out paragraph long descriptions of every test case that you ran as if it was like me and you sitting next to each other and sending packets back and forth and confirming that like the right pixels showed up on the screen. Right. Yeah. So
I remember that I was doing a web app, so I had to like test all the endpoints.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm not writing out a paragraph for all this.
Yeah.
So like for each test case, I had like a decorated the function with a comment, and I just made a thing that would generate all that into a PDF, and like, here you go.
Yeah. Exactly. So I think it's interesting for people coming from school. Less and less of the job is actually about writing things versus understanding how they work. And the sooner you can get comfortable with the tools that help you understand why things are doing what they're doing, the better.
Okay.
So this whole set of things that people are calling observability or telemetry data or whatever they want to call it, right?
Yeah.
The sooner you can get comfortable with those, like imagine if we were doing the types of assignments we were doing in school. We were doing a whole lot of network programming, right?
Yeah.
Imagine if we had the tools we had now. I mean, they existed, but we didn't know about them.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out like at 3 a.m, how come the packet isn't showing up with the data we want it to, right? Like,
yeah.
It would completely change things. And those are the types of things that like software engineering is not a whole lot of fun writing lots of code. I mean, maybe every once in a while, but and again, we're in a very specific area of software, right? Like we're not writing end user iOS apps or something like that, but the job is more being curious about why things are happening and how they're happening than implementing new things.
Yeah, I can see that. It's been a big shift for me coming from somewhere that did network security into somewhere that's doing observability. Because network security, while there's complexity, it was very like the parameters are very specific. You see this threat, you stop it. Like that's like the end goal here. But as observability, it's like, it's not a boxed in thing to be working in. You're kind of like, here's the chaos and figure out a way to observe it, like to measure it. And thank God the OTel community, like open source, is figuring that out. And like I don't have to worry about how, what sort of meter provider, like what goes into measuring a metric. I don't have to worry about that. But knowing that that's part of the problem is interesting to me, and also like very daunting or very intimidating, but cool to know.
Yeah. I mean, we don't have to go into it, but there's a bit of a can of worms there in terms of like the automatic instrumentation and all that, right?
Okay.
Like, at the end of the day, as the person writing the software and maintaining the software, you're going to know, or because you got paged at 3 a.m, learn that certain things are important to measure, right? And those aren't necessarily things that like automatic instrumentation can measure for you. Maybe it can measure how much memory your thing's using, or how much CPU, or if you're using a garbage collected language, like how many garbage collection runs have we ran and how long did each one take?
Right.
But it has no idea about the business logic within your application, right? It doesn't know that this particular process is doing this very specific thing. And as part of doing that, you want to measure something, right? Not that actually doing that is that complex. but I think it's important for people to recognize that like you're going to learn these things regardless of whether you're using these tools or not. These tools just make it easier for you to get that information.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know enough about it, but yeah, makes sense to me.
Imagine like, okay, so when you're using the Prometheus client library, right?
Yeah.
Whatever language you're using it for, it starts collecting metrics from the runtime for you.
Right.
So for Go, it collects how much memory is being used in garbage collection, blah, blah, blah. Maybe for Java, it does the same thing. For, I don't know, maybe it's collecting information about like the number of concurrent processes, because like Go has Go routines, right?
These are like the default reporting things.
Right, the things that are specific to your language.
Right.
And maybe it can hook into like the networking stack, right?
Right.
With like eBPF, and it can tell you this is how many packets you've sent and over what connection and on what port.
Yeah.
But at least right now, to my knowledge, it can't do the like, this is specific to my app.
Right.
And I want to know this information.
Right.
Yeah.
Like if your endpoint is talking about how many pizzas are being made, you're knowing how much memory is being consumed is not going to help if like the pizzas being made are not happening. You're not collecting that.
Right. Like if your piece of software is an e-commerce website, like, okay, maybe you can correlate memory usage with latency, and higher latency means you sold less things. But if you're not also tracking how many things we sold and measuring that over a period of time and seeing that, oh, when the latency increased and we also saw that the memory increased, maybe that was the cause of the latency. And when the latency increased, our sales went down accordingly.
Right. Okay. Like actual, like actionable insights. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Very cool. I feel like we talked a lot about observability, which is great because I'm learning a lot from this.
Yeah.
Let's see. I guess the second part of the interview is more about like telling more about yourself and like what is your story. I guess I would love to ask you, Callum, what is your story to getting to this point? And you can put in whatever you think is relevant. But
I mean, I guess we kind of covered some of it, right?
Yeah.
Like you and I went to school together. The school we went to was compared to others a little bit intense. Like the class time and the amount of hours you're expected to spend on assignments is essentially a full-time job.
Yeah.
Whereas like university, maybe you take 3 classes a semester or something.
Yeah, I was DJing at a university like 4 years ago, and I was very envious.
Yeah.
Because I was like, wow, these kids have so much time.
Exactly. Yeah. And then I ended up working at, as I said, like an automated testing company.
Yeah.
And at that company, I was essentially doing 2 things. One was building like an internal private cloud for these automated tests to run on. And then another was like this network tunneling software.
Yeah.
So you can imagine that like people who are testing their iOS apps might have some kind of sensitive information, like the government testing a new employee app or something like that.
Yeah.
So we basically had a way for them to tunnel into our network, pass that information along, the test would get run, that kind of thing, right?
Okay.
While I was there, the monitoring service was falling over, not working properly. That's how I got involved in this observability kind of space. I guess as a result of that, that's the space I wanted to work in. But for me, the biggest thing at the time, at least, was using Go and having a position that was remote.
Yeah.
At the time, I was not super happy about living here. I actually, at that company that I was at, spent 6 months traveling and working remote.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Because they when the company was formed, it was kind of pretty remote friendly. When I joined, they had like 5 to 10 people in Poland and people in South America and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so when I started there full time, I was initially an intern. I told them like, hey, I'm not planning to leave the company, but like Vancouver, I don't know. So I'm gonna go traveling. And then I didn't really find somewhere that I for sure wanted to go to.
Yeah.
I came back. The company kind of was going a bit downhill, in my opinion. So I was interviewing at essentially every place that I could find that was Go, remote, and ideally observability.
Yeah.
And I know people were at Grafana at the beginning were a bit annoyed. Like every time we got together, they'd be talking about, oh, we know this person at this company. I'd be like, yeah, I interviewed with that person.
Yeah.
Like every single company they brought up, they're like, Callum, shut up. We don't care.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I had tracked like 150 applications.
Holy.
Whatever number of interviews, blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
like spreadsheet kind of thing.
It's like that CS career questions graph.
Yeah, it ends up with like a single
One offer
out of 300 companies.
Yeah, it's rough out there right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't want to do that again.
Would you say that your entry into tech was more traditional or non-traditional? And I guess I don't even know what the terms mean, but like...
in terms of like deciding to go into it in the first place?
Yeah, I guess so.
I had no fucking idea what I was doing.
Okay. Hell yeah. All right.
Okay, so here in high school,
Yeah.
in the last year of high school, you do planning, right? Which is like, I guess kind of you do it in grade 10, 12, grade 10 as well. But in grade 12, you do the second version of this planning class, at least at my high school. And as part of that, they're like, what do you want to do? And we'll pay for you to apply for it.
Oh,
and
they paid for it? Wow, okay.
Yeah, one university application up to like $150 or something.
That's cool. I didn't get that, right?
And I was like,
I don't know.
I don't know. Like, so not to brag or anything, but high school was easy for me.
Yeah.
And so I didn't try at all. Like the only class that I found kind of difficult was calculus.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't need it. So I dropped out after 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
I was the kind of person where like, if I can get 80% and not have to try it all, then I'll get 80%.
Right.
That was me in high school, right? The only thing that I was interested in doing was playing video games. And so as soon as school was done at 3:00, I would walk home as fast as I could because I could walk home faster than the bus showed up.
Right.
And then I would, other than eating and getting yelled at by my family for like not leaving the house and doing social things, play video games.
What were you playing?
All kinds of stuff, mostly competitive things. So
Okay.
I played Team Fortress. I did pretty good at that. I played MMOs, like not World of Warcraft, but that genre.
Okay.
And so at the end of high school, they're like, we'll pay for you to apply to anything. And I was like, I don't fucking know.
Yeah.
At the time, I thought I wanted to do concept art.
Oh,
which is basically like
for video games.
For video games or movies or something, where they basically tell you, hey, we have a show that we're going to do about X, and here's like some things that we don't know what we want them to look like, but here's like a description of the character or description of the scene and the mood and they have like some references, right?
Right.
And you're supposed to in your head come up with like sketches and then more kind of fully rendered concepts of what that thing might be.
Right.
Because like at the time, collector's editions for games were really big.
Okay.
I don't know if you remember this time, like mid to late 2000s.
Like Team Fortress or like Half-Life Collector's Edition.
Yeah. Right. It'd be like the big box and there'd always be an art book.
Right.
And the art book would have the concept art.
Okay.
I was like, this is the coolest shit I've ever seen.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And there was also at the time on YouTube still wasn't massive.
Mm-hmm.
There were these things called speed paint videos.
Oh, I remember those.
Which are basically like digital artists in Photoshop.
Yeah.
Like compressing like 12 hours worth of work into a 1 minute video or something.
Right. Yeah.
So I thought I wanted to do that, but I was not good at drawing and I hadn't put any effort into it.
Mm-hmm.
So in this planning class, there's like this massive list on the computer of all the schools in BC or Alberta or whatever it was. And I just clicked literally the first thing that said computers in the title.
It helped that our institution was near the top.
Yeah, right. Yeah. B is pretty close.
Yeah.
The first year I thought I was going to drop out.
Yeah.
I hated it. We had to do like Java enterprise development and I did not like that at all. But then we had a computer architecture class, which is basically like, here's how computers work.
And you did CST. Yeah,
I did CST and I took the data communications option, which is here's how network communication works.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed that. I don't know if that was the beginning or if that was just like the first time that I can really remember of like having this like wanting to understand how something works and finding that process really interesting.
Yeah.
But that was why I stayed. And then between when you and I met, I went to SFU for 1 semester.
Right. Yeah, that was interesting. I was curious about that.
That was a shit show. I think technically I'm still on academic probation at SFU. I passed everything. I think I just didn't do well enough.
Yeah.
For like the School of Applied Sciences, whatever they call it there, as far as they're concerned. Went back to BCIT. You and I met.
Yeah.
And then the rest we've kind of talked about.
Nice.
Yeah. So yeah, not traditional at all, I guess. I mean, maybe a little bit in the sense that like I was the loner kid who liked video games, but like I remember I had that planning course at the beginning of grade 12.
Yeah.
And after I did that and I saw like, oh yeah, you're going to do programming. I knew one person who'd been involved in programming, and I was like, what is HTML? And he sent me like this tutorial, and I was like, I don't care. I have no idea what this is. I'm just going to wait until they teach it to me.
Right.
So I remember even in like the first programming classes for like 2 or 3 months, not understanding the concept of a parameter to a function.
Right.
Right. Like you write the function add.
Yeah.
And the 2 parameters are x and y. And then inside the function, you do x plus y and return.
Right.
I was like, what the hell is
why are these weird names?
I don't understand this at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was so confused. Yeah. So no, I was not at all the person who had like, my dad was a programmer, and so he showed me what it was.
Right.
Yeah. Not at all.
Okay. This might be kind of reaching, but I know some parts of your history, and I will ask a very random question. There might not be a connection, but you're a very good snowboarder.
Okay.
Do you find that there are any connections between snowboarding and software engineering? This one's a reach, so if there isn't any, that's fine.
I mean, I guess I can make one if you want.
Send it, yeah.
So at least for me, like skiing and then snowboarding and then skiing again, I was never interested in like the run, the groomed. This is a blue run.
Okay.
I was like, where can I go that's more interesting, more fun, like potentially almost running into a tree or something like that. But like, what's the more interesting path to the end result, right? A lot of the times, what we do, there isn't a defined best way to do something. The best way depends on like your specific needs out of the thing, right?
Right.
Somebody else might have written a blog post that says, here's the best way to do X.
Yeah.
But then at the bottom, they say, we had these constraints,
right.
and you have different constraints, right? Maybe you want to do it the fastest, or maybe you want to do it in the least amount of memory, or whatever, right? So in that sense, like, people talk about programming being creative. It is a little bit, right? But yeah, I guess.
I like, and that reminds me because I've been writing blog posts again.
Yep.
And I don't know if it's like just me looking back and where I am now in my career, but I felt like 2012 to 2018 was just like the success porn of blog posting for software engineers. And what I mean by that, and like I'm sure that this exists today too, but it's just like the best Node.js framework to do this, and like those exist today as well. But I feel like I've gotten better as a blogger, because now I will never say like this is the best way. I will like make those disclaimers very big, like this is the best Terraform thing to do if you want to do this. I'm happy that blogging has gotten better. Like I'm happy I'm doing that more. But you're right. There used to be a lot of blog posts that were like, this is the best way.
Yeah.
But why? Like what?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think especially because of COVID, the industry in general had a bit of a downturn, and that like just straight up BSing is gone a little bit.
Yeah.
Partially because like maybe those people don't have jobs anymore.
Yeah.
And also like for certain things, like the framework of the month is important, but for the most part, it's not.
Yeah.
Like we always talk about, use the best tool for the job, blah, 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 blah. A lot of times the best tool for the job is just pick something, and if it doesn't work 6 months from now, like change it.
Yeah.
If you spend more time trying to pick exactly the right tool, you're just wasting time not doing something.
Yeah. I got to sit in on a coding interview for the second time.
I saw that.
Yeah. I hate coding interviews. I've done 3 in my life and I've sucked at all of them. And the first one was actually like, the feedback was very harsh and not constructive. So it turned me off from it for a long time.
Interesting. For the most part, you don't ever get feedback. Is my experience.
They kind of went through it with me.
Oh,
And I
okay.
was
So
like,
like a review. Oh, yeah.
I guess it's a review. But I wish they would have started the review with like, you didn't get the job and like, it's fine, but let's go through it versus
Right.
like, here's what we think. By the way, you didn't get the job. I'm like, that's like the ordering would have helped a lot here.
Yeah. It's the old like, don't open the interview, but with like niceties.
Yeah.
Ask for the thing you want and then
Yeah.
how are your kids?
Yeah.
Right? Because if you do it the other way around, it looks like you're just trying to BS the person to then get the thing you want.
Right.
Whereas if you ask for it and then put the other thing, it's like, hey, I need this thing from you. Also,
Yeah.
this other stuff, like if you have time, I care about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Like, yeah, interviews are weird. So I'm curious, especially after you post that
Yeah.
message saying it was your first one, was this a conscious decision on your part not to be part of interviews before that, or did you just not be asked?
I hadn't been asked because I've only been at this company for now a year, almost a year. But like before this, I was helping more on the behavioral panels or just like the pre-screeners.
Yep.
And the SRE position didn't have interviews before, so now they do.
Didn't have interviews.
Sorry. The SRE position didn't have a coding interview before.
Okay.
They had technical interviews where you would like storyboard or walk through systems.
Yep.
But this is the first time we're doing a coding and scripting interview, so that's the caveat there.
Okay.
But it's like I've done technical interviews where they've asked you to build something, and I would just get analysis paralysis. Like, oh god, like how is the best way to do this?
Yeah.
But I saw this candidate walk through the problem, and it was cool because it was like they would talk through the problem and they would just start building. And like that's like the biggest thing. Like I've taken away from this. This is like do something, do anything, and then figure it out later. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if I agree with that entirely, but I guess it also, the cliche answer is it depends on what you have to do, right?
I feel like, I mean, a stable way is like brute force, go quick, and then like iterate versus like just wait to like you should consider trade-offs and factors.
Yeah.
And like the more experienced you are, the faster you get at that.
Yep.
But I think, and this is advice for me, I guess, is just like build something and then go from there.
Yeah. My suggestion would be, as long as you understand how you would change things when you do inevitably need to,
Yeah.
as you're brute forcing that thing, that's what I would look out for. So I've done a lot of these interviews as the interviewer.
Yeah.
The problem that I see is like the two typical ones, right? People either analysis paralysis and read the entire description and every test case and try to plan out the whole thing, and then we're halfway through the interview and they haven't even written a single line of code, right?
Right.
Or they go immediately into coding without having read the whole description or the tests or asked us any clarifying questions, and they code for half an hour and they've coded themselves into a hole that they don't know how to dig themselves out of.
Right.
Yeah, I know it's kind of a BS answer, but I would just say try to be in the middle. Don't try to avoid going from one end to the other, right? If you can start right away, but also have set things up such like that you can ask us questions and then easily or relatively easy refactor things. Because I don't know. The start and do anything is a good advice.
Yeah.
I know lots of people are afraid of the like, oh, but if I don't finish and get the 100% correct answer, then I fail automatically, right?
Yeah.
I would say if that's the policy the company has, you probably don't want to work there.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Right? Like, that's not the way real life works. It's not even the way that code that's been reviewed works.
Yeah.
Shit happens all the time that 2 or 3 or 4 reviewers over multiple years didn't notice. It's being able to ask the clarifying questions and course correct and explain what you're doing along the way that is interesting in an interview from the interviewer's perspective, right?
100%. Like, I think for SREs especially, like communicating is super important.
Yeah.
Like, cause like that's what you're doing in incidents.
Yeah.
Okay. Sweet. I think we're down to our last question because we've been going for a while.
Yeah,
are you doing okay?
Yep.
Cool. I think we'll probably end off with this one, which is, what is your hottest take for people in your role right now? Sadie's was don't be a dick. So you can make it whatever you want.
Do you mean like my title or like specifically within our area of
like software engineering? So Sadie was talking about being a tech lead and communicating.
Yep.
Jeff talked about, being a front end developer, but also just like getting ahead in career.
Yep.
Like as a software engineer, like what would be your hottest take right now?
The thing that's been really hard for me to accept the last 2 years, as I went from kind of being stuck in an intermediate position and trying to find my way out of that, having multiple conversations with people on my team and managers who I really respected, was you're only as good as the last thing you've shipped.
Okay. Tell me more.
So
you said the same thing to me when we were in college too. Like you've written a lot of code, but what have you shipped?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I, for multiple reasons, but there was basically a 2 to 3 year period where I personally felt like I was senior. And I was not able to essentially convince the people that would eventually say yes, promote Callum, to make that argument, right? Because it kind of sucks, but when you want a promotion, you have to build a case for it, right?
It's a business case, yeah.
And you need to convince the people that say yes or no that they should say yes or no to you instead of someone else. Kind of, right? Because not always, but a lot of the time there's a quota of how many people can be promoted this cycle, right? And if somebody else has checked all the boxes for a longer period of time than you, they're going to probably be promoted over you, right? Maybe you'll get it next time around. But and so the argument that I at the time was making was like, look at this thing that I maintain, this Prometheus remote write, blah, blah, blah. It's the way we get data into our system, and that system makes X% of the company's revenue, right? Like that thing's super important. I maintain it. I every once in a while build these new features and improvements on it. At the time, we were like, it's more or less feature complete, right? That's kind of changing now. But I was like, how come that isn't enough, right? And the manager, director, I don't know exactly how you define the different roles, but the guy who I was talking to at the time basically said, yeah, but the last time you did a major piece of work on that was 2 years ago. What have you done since then?
Right.
What's like not a bug fix, not a tiny PR review that makes something 1% faster, right? What's like the last thing that you really shipped?
Right.
I think trying to relate this to something that like in my past I had this same like logical fallacy, I guess, right? Like so within have you ever played MMOs like WoW or anything like that?
Yeah. I've been playing Diablo, but
yeah. So kind of similar, like in these games, there will be pieces of content, like a specific thing that you and a group of people will do. And
like a raid.
Exactly, a raid. And in the past, I don't know as much anymore because I don't really play them anymore. But in the past, like getting a piece of gear, like an upgrade, makes your character stronger, would be pretty important. And you'd get, for the most part, a pretty big upgrade from doing one of these things. And I had a hard time disconnecting, like, how come I wasn't the one getting a piece of gear, but this new guy was? And then you'd look at, in these games, you have a way to essentially look at who's done the most damage or who's done the most healing or blah, 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 right? You can only rely on the fact that you're more senior in terms of like time for so long.
Right.
It's interesting. I went to a conference earlier this year in Tokyo. And this is one of the things that I think Asian work culture has completely backwards.
Okay.
And one of the reasons why I think they kind of peaked in the 80s and haven't really been able to keep up as much since then. They're like, it's the same as the school system here. Once you're a certain level of seniority, which is completely arbitrarily like no skill required, it's just time based.
Yeah.
You can basically coast after that.
Right.
Whereas here, like the example that people like to complain about is like the woman, I am 99% sure, the woman who came up with the idea for Toy Story.
Okay.
They came up with this idea for Toy Story. It was
Like
kind of
the movie.
exactly
Yeah.
the original, the first one. The executives didn't really think it was going to do very well. They put like kind of the misfits of Pixar on that. This is my understanding, so maybe I'm wrong. And they basically said like, this is going to fail. Try and salvage it if you want to, but you might not have a job.
Right.
And then it became massive, right?
Yeah.
And then 20 years later, they fired her.
Okay.
She hadn't really done anything since then, is my understanding of it, right?
Right.
So, yeah, I don't know if that's so much of a hot take as like a hard thing to accept, especially when you're someone new, right? Like detaching yourself from your code as like, oh, this is my value, and look at all of these awesome things I've done in the past, right? But like one was the most recent one, right? It kind of sucks that like you have to keep raising the bar,
Yeah.
but at the same time, if you don't want to, there's plenty of other places where you don't have to, and you can still make a good living, and the rest of your life can be awesome, right? But, as someone who, like moving up was, like the fact that I hadn't was kind of mentally exhausting for me.
Yeah.
Trying to figure that out for multiple years.
I can imagine that would take a toll. Like that would be hard to like keep thinking about.
Yeah, right. It was like, I felt like I had the skills. I felt like I had been doing the work. I was literally looking at like our matrix of what is a senior engineer versus,
Right.
and I was doing everything except for like the last thing I shipped, right? I was on call. I was good at on call. I was helping with other people's incidents, teaching new people on the team, even new people that were more senior than me. I knew about multiple pieces of the code base.
Yeah.
All of that, but literally project work. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it becomes even more important, especially when budgets get tightened, and we're in the situation we're in now. You have to demonstrate value. I'm trying to think more about, like you mentioned, like it's, I could see where there's like, it seems like a contrast or at odds with detach your value from the code you ship, because especially it's one, good for your mental health, but two, like that's the only way you can like actually take in feedback without being attacked.
Yeah.
At the same time, you need to realize that your value in terms of like getting promoted is tied to how much deliverable, like actionable value you can provide. Your example was like the MMO, like how much DPS have you done in this raid?
Yeah.
And like if it's high enough, it's like cool, you get more gear, you get promoted.
Yeah.
I think as a fresh grad, like a new employee, it's not like how much damage can you do, but like can you like stop dying? Like,
Right.
can you like keep up in the raid where you don't need to be healed all the time? Like that's the thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the more senior you get, if you want to get that gear, you gotta demonstrate that value. And I see what you mean that like, it'd be nice if we didn't have to always be doing that, but also I think it's part of the industry, right? Like we get compensated very well for what we do, and to keep going up and getting all those opportunities. Just
and it's not necessarily that you have to do that literally all the time. Right? Like only a very small percentage of people can or want to do that, right? And those are the types of people that are on the stage at conferences all the time and all that, right? Like it was very hard for me to accept that I wasn't going to be one of those people, and that like I wasn't the type of person where after work I could sit and learn about that thing and then do a passion project or something like that, right? Like I thought those were things that you had to do in order to get to a certain level, and they certainly help, right? They'll accelerate things for sure, no question about it. The more time you spend on it, but at the same time, like if you're spending time on it and you don't enjoy it, then it's not worth it, right?
Yeah. I'm trying to do that now, but like this podcast is fun.
Yeah.
But like I'm trying to see how long I can keep it up before it starts burning me out, because like if it's fun, it's fun. But if you keep doing it all the time, it's like it shouldn't feel like work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Cool.
Well, thanks, Callum. That's
Yeah.
been a long interview. It's probably the longest one we've done. I will ask you one last question, which is there anything else you would like to say before we conclude? The stage is yours.
I can start a flame war.
Send it.
All right. I think everybody's definition of what observability is wrong, and fighting about it is a waste of time. Everybody likes to say, "Oh, observability is this, observability is that.
Yeah.
Metrics aren't observability." Blah blah blah. At the end of the day, the people that are using your software don't give a shit about what your definition of observability is. All they care about is whether or not they can understand why their software is doing what it's doing. And they don't care about what type of information they're using to do that, right? I've seen a lot of these projects or companies like market themselves as metrics are shit, we're way better, or company X is bad and we're way better. But I just fundamentally disagree with that way of describing and trying to sell things.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, like the only way you build the biggest tower is by building the biggest tower, not by tearing everybody else's tower down. Right? So, yeah, don't give a shit about what everybody tells you observability is. It's just a way to understand what's happening, regardless of what information or who's giving you the information.
Right. So your personal definition would be it's to know what your software is doing.
Yeah, it's a way of understanding the behavior and performance of your piece of software.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks, Callum. Appreciate you being on the show.
Yeah, no problem. That was fun.
Yeah. Hope you'll be back on in the future.
Yeah, whenever you want.
Sweet.
I'm good.